respiratory system. Looking at the lower respiratory system, the larynx. We watched the video last time of Steven Tyler and his glottis, and looking at the procedures that were done to improve the function of his vocal cords, because he had some little nodules on his vocal cords that was affecting his ability to sing. So moving down then, looking at what's below the larynx is the trachea, and we notice that there is C-shaped cartilage that forms the wall of the trachea in the front. So that keeps the trachea open on the front and sides, and behind the trachea is the esophagus, and that does not have anything holding it open. So when we swallow a bolus of food, that's what opens up that esophagus and allows that food to move downward through muscle contractions, smooth muscle contractions. And we'll talk about that with the digestive system. So in the back here, we don't see cartilage. That way, if a bolus of food is pushing its way down through the esophagus, it can bulge into the trachea to allow more room for that esophagus. And that's not going to matter because we're not breathing while we're swallowing. So recall, at the end of the trachea is a special structure here. This last piece of cartilage has a special piece of cartilage with sensory receptors called the carina, and that stimulates a violent coughing reflex when food or water hits that piece of cartilage that is found in the lumen of the trachea at the very bottom. And then it branches into the primary bronchi that serve each lung. So the conducting zone is, there's no gas exchange occurring here. We're just bringing air into the body through the mouth or the nasal cavity, through the larynx to the trachea, and that's the conducting zone. No gas exchange occurs there. After the trachea, there's the bronchi branch into secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, and then 23 more smaller branchings until we get to the bronchioles. And the bronchioles are only controlled, their opening and closing, or their diameter, I should say, is only controlled by smooth muscle. So we call this the respiratory zone because it leads to the alveoli. At the very end of the bronchioles are the alveoli, and that's where gas exchange occurs, is across the walls of the alveoli. So it's important that these bronchioles remain open to get air going to and from the alveoli for that gas exchange to take place. So here we can see the tracheobronchial tree. Here we have the trachea, the bronchi, but when we get out here to the very end, these are the bronchioles. The very end here of the airways are the bronchioles, and they lead to these sacs of alveoli called alveolar sacs. And again, this is where gas exchange takes place. So if we look at one particular sac here, we can do a cross-section view and see that there's a duct, which is simple squamous epithelium with these individual air sacs for gas exchange. And also what we find wrapped around the alveoli are these capillaries, these pulmonary capillaries. So this is going to lead to the pulmonary vein and carry this oxygenated blood back to the heart. This vessel here is coming from the pulmonary artery, which is bringing deoxygenated blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen from the alveoli. So we see a transition across these capillaries from blue to red as they're picking up oxygen from the alveoli. At the same time, in these vessels is a high concentration of carbon dioxide, and that's going to leave the pulmonary capillary and enter the alveoli to be exhaled. So we have, on this side, we have dropping off of CO2 and picking up of oxygen, and then that carries that freshly oxygenated blood back to the heart via the pulmonary vein. So we have an animation here we can watch, that shows the details here of it's not going to cooperate, it looks like here. I have to go like this.
The respiratory system moves air through the nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, and bronchus to the alveoli where the gas exchange between oxygen and carbon dioxide occurs. Nares are the openings to the nose. The nasal cavity is lined with cilia, mucous membranes, and blood capillaries. The air is filtered by cilia, moistened by mucous membranes, and warmed by the blood. Air moves into the pharynx or throat, the common passageway for food and air. Air continues on to the larynx. The epiglottis, a flap of tissue in front of the larynx, closes off the larynx when swallowing to prevent food from entering. The larynx, or voice box, contains the vocal folds. The trachea, or windpipe, connects the larynx to the bronchial tree. The cartilage rings of the trachea prevent the trachea from collapsing. Lungs are spongy tissue with alveoli and blood capillaries. Breathing occurs because of the expansion and contraction of the lungs. The bronchi carrying the air subdivide into smaller branches called bronchioles. At the end of each bronchiole are the alveolar sacs. The alveolar sacs are surrounded by blood capillaries and contain millions of single-layer alveoli cells where the gas exchange takes place. Oxygenated air goes from the nose to the pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchus, and alveoli. By the process of diffusion, oxygen in the air moves from the alveoli to the capillaries. Carbon dioxide moves from the capillaries to the alveoli and is exhaled. This process is called respiration.